right. And there are seats up front, so feel free to come down front and send people down up front as more come in. And I know we are getting some more chairs. This is a wonderful turnout for Dr. Mary Pattillo. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Pattillo. I actually first learned of Dr. Pattillo upon discovering her book, Black Picket Fences, about the challenges of black middle-class communities in our country. Dr. Pattillo is a professor of sociology and in the African-American Studies department, where she does research regularly on Chicago and challenges around race, space, and class in Chicago. And incidentally, she is the Harold Washington Professor at Northwestern University. As I said, Dr. Pattillo uses the city of Chicago as her laboratory and strives to be an expert in Chicago history, politics, and social life. The book that I first learned of her through, Black Picket Fences, investigates the economic, spatial, and cultural forces that affect child rearing and youth socialization in the black middle-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Black Picket Fences won the Oliver Cromwell Cox Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association. Her second book, Black on the Block, published by University of Chicago, focused on gentrification and public housing transformation in North Kenwood, Oakland, on Chicago's South Side. The book develops the concept of middlemen and middlewomen and the roles that black professionals play in working alternatively to mediate or exacerbate racial and class inequality. And that book won the Robert Park Book Award and a proclamation from the city of Chicago. Her current research projects, which we're going to hear about today, include a study of how parents negotiate school choice. Well, this is one of her current research projects, and how families make housing choices in Chicago. Dr. Pattillo also has a growing interest in race in Latin America. Is a member of the MacArthur Foundation funded research network on how housing matters for families and children. She is a founding board member and active participant in the Urban Prep Charter Academy, the first all-boys public charter school in the city of Chicago. While there are a few topics I've asked Dr. Pattillo she would touch on, she's going to focus today on the challenges of mixed-income communities and how mixed-income housing policies actually play out on the ground. And Chicago's her landscape, so I'm really interested to hear how that plays out in the Chicago area. So without further ado, I bring to you Dr. Pattillo.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction, and thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Adrian and Alexia who were so helpful in coordinating my visit here. So middle-class households are a hot commodity. They're touted by policymakers and urban planners as necessary participants in curing the ills of public housing and the plague of urban poverty more generally. And rich households, if you can get them to the city, are even better. Using the same logic, then, we often think of poverty as a kind of drag on cities. The lower the proportion of poor people, the better. The middle class continues to be lionized for its generative capacities, not only for the material resources that middle class households bring, and that they bring to struggling cities and neighborhoods and cities, but also for their enactment and modeling of proper ways of living in neighborhoods, proper ways of being civic citizens. Hence, poverty rates can be lowered in a number of ways. I highlight three here, poverty rates in cities. Number one, of course, we can help poor city residents get out of poverty. So if their own individual poverty changes, then of course they won't be the statistic in the poverty rate. Number two, we can increase the raw numbers of non-poor people living in cities by attracting them from elsewhere. Number three, we can decrease the number of poor people living in cities by sending them somewhere else. So, of course, number one is what motivates all of us. So the hope is to improve the socioeconomic condition of poor individuals and poor families. But much of housing policy, especially prior to the current administration, used strategies 2 and 3 as the routes to attain strategy number one. So I'm going to focus on those kinds of policies, especially mixed income housing policies. But then I'll talk a little bit about, or probably gesture towards, the new funding streams for things like promise neighborhoods and, to a lesser extent, choice neighborhoods, which have changed the focus a bit away from numbers 2 and 3 and put the focus back directly on number 1. So I'll talk, though, mostly about past policies and how they are continuing to play out today, and then gesture towards some of the things that are happening now. So any place-based anti-poverty policy will have decidedly racial contours. The poverty rate among blacks and Latinos nationally is about 3 times that of the poverty rate for non-Hispanic whites. And because of racial segregation, there's a greater likelihood that black and Latino neighborhoods will have high poverty rates than white neighborhoods. So this gives you a sense. This is from the 2000 census. Some of these kinds of figures are easier to show with 2000 census than 2010 census, which of course was a short form and you have to aggregate the American Community Survey. But this is from the 2000 census, and I have your metropolitan area here and my metropolitan area. Things are a little better, or much better, in your metropolitan area. This is the proportion of blacks, whites, Hispanics, and Asians who live in neighborhoods that are over 20% poor. So what you see in both metro areas is the racial disparity, such that a larger proportion of African Americans are likely to live in poor neighborhoods that are more than 20% poor, than do whites, Hispanics, and Asians in your metro area. But the situation is much more severe in the Chicago metro area, where nearly half of all African Americans live in neighborhoods that are over 20% poor. And you also see that about a quarter of Latinos live in neighborhoods that are over 20% poor, and many fewer whites. So when we talk about urban poverty, when we talk about high poverty neighborhoods, we're simultaneously talking about race, given that black neighborhoods are disproportionately affected by concentrated poverty. So when we consider race and class, neighborhoods that have high poverty rates, most of which are black and Latino, will either be the targets of middle-class resettlement projects or the targets of deconcentration efforts. Again, attracting people in or moving people out. So they'll be the places that will be doing most of our work when we think about creating mixed-income neighborhoods. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of policies that I'm talking about, although they're, second nature to you all, mostly I'll be talking a lot about Hope 6, and this is the language that is included on HUD's website. Hope 6 aims to, quote, lessen concentrations of poverty by placing public housing in non-poverty neighborhoods and promoting mixed-income communities. Housing choice vouchers is another strategy to promote mixed-income areas this is the moving poor families out of poor neighborhoods into non-poor neighborhoods by allowing very low-income families to choose and lease or purchase safe, decent, and affordable privately owned or rented housing. And, of course, some of the emphasis on opportunity moves are specifically the kinds of strategies to promote mixed-income communities. Choice neighborhoods is the more current, present-day policy. Choice neighborhood grants transforms. I think there's a verb. This is wrong in there. This is a quote, though. Transforms distressed neighborhoods and public and assisted projects into viable and sustainable mixed-income neighborhoods by linking housing improvements with appropriate services, schools, public assets, transportation, and access to jobs. So in all of these, again, you see the buzzwords of mixed-income communities, with the assumption of the value added of these middle-class households to neighborhoods that either had been poor or middle-class households in the neighborhoods that are the destinations of poor families moving with housing choice vouchers. The benefits being that they boost property and income tax revenue. Middle-income households, attract tax-paying businesses. They make political contributions, campaign contributions, and they require fewer social services. So they bring in money and they cost less. The justification for mixed income policies very much comes from sociological research, and especially from the work of William Julius Wilson. So the importance of middle-class neighborhoods was emphasized in William Julius Wilson's book, The Truly Disadvantaged. Positing that high levels of neighborhood poverty had negative consequences for residents above and beyond their individual poverty, Wilson and others initiated a research industry to uncover and describe what he and others call concentration effects. This above and beyond my own individual poverty, the effects of living in a high poverty neighborhood. While Wilson lobbied more forcefully for labor market and safety net reforms, he made brief mention of, quote, the reintegration of the neighborhood with working and middle-class blacks and black professionals. He was particularly talking about black neighborhoods. And he talked about this as one possible strategy for strengthening poor neighborhoods. However, Wilson was not at all hopeful about this strategy, and he called it, quote, the so-called self-help programs to revitalize the inner city. And he was later surprised when, quote, it received so much serious attention from the media and policymakers. So given Wilson's own distancing from such a strategy, it's curious that urban planners have latched on to this idea of mixed income communities and instead eschewed Wilson's more forceful proposals for things like investments in education, training, promotion of union-friendly policies, universal social programs, and living wage policies. But on second inspection, it makes sense why urban planners, especially at the city level, might do this, might again emphasize mixed income policies over the more universal and labor market and structural reforms that Wilson talked about, because it is, of course, mixed income policies are consonant with urban elites' interests in recapturing the middle class, again, for the city's tax base, for campaign contributions, for attracting other kinds of amenities. So let me move to some general critiques of the mixed income approach, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about my own research. Mixed income communities as cures to urban poverty represent a decidedly non-structural policy intervention. I just mentioned some of the structural changes that could be made, social safety net reforms, living wage policies, labor market changes. These are non-structural policy interventions that rely on the prospect of cross-class contact with between the middle class and poor residents as the main lever process by which we are hoping to attain that policy goal number one that I put up earlier about improving the lives of poor families. The increased municipal revenue that comes with the influx of middle-class residents, that is, the leverage that new middle-class people bring, could in theory equalize the structural landscape by funding things like high-quality public schools, wage increases for civil service workers, or investments in public transportation. But in practice, such a redistribution of resources often takes a back seat to feeding the demands of the new gentry for more public art, street enhancements, and support for more high-end housing, recreational, and commercial activities. Because both the public sector and the private market cater to the coveted middle-class citizen consumer, the underlying structures of inequality are left intact, even if the neighborhood often looks better. Finally, if gentrification is that point at which mixed-income communities tip in the direction of the newcomers, then whatever structural reforms have been enacted, whenever there are school improvements, whenever there are more jobs, whenever there's a cleaner environment, now disproportionately benefits those who have moved in, the incoming gentry, rather than the outgoing poor residents. In this formulation, the mixed income approach without any brakes or safeguards against displacement reinforces and replicates a spatialized system of haves and have-nots, and sometimes in this case with the support of governments through these mixed income policies. So now I'll turn to some specific critiques of such policies. I argue that the popular mixed income approach has four important weaknesses. First, it plans for racial integration but underestimates the tenacity of racial segregation, to resegregate racially mixed areas, and to maintain some parts of the city as majority black and increasingly so majority Latino. Secondly, it ignores the fact that while many black neighborhoods are already mixed income, this hasn't led to their socioeconomic stability or prosperity or particular advantages for the families who live in them when you compare them to majority white neighborhoods. Third, mixed income strategies promote what I call in my own research a tyranny of the middle class, which denigrates the life ways of poor families and subjects them to various behavior modification programs that's not required of the middle class folks who move into them. And finally, mixed income approaches begin to have a life of their own, and they begin to have a kind of cookie cutter form to them, and they become the means for things that aren't always the same ends that they were initially meant for. Indeed, what I'll talk about in one case in Chicago is they become the means for the ends of using formerly the land where former public housing once stood for, in urban planning speak, higher and better purposes. So let me elaborate each of these critiques, some longer, more than others. Critique number one, moving poor and black families into non-poor and predominantly white areas has garnered sufficient resistance from white homeowners and communities that it has been possible only on a small scale. And in the written version of this, I have all kinds of citations within the parentheses for illustrations of the kinds of resistance that scattered site housing programs have met, Section 8 housing or housing choice voucher programs, opportunity area programs have met, and so on. This means that many low-income African-American families with vouchers will take the path of least resistance and simply move to other fragile, often lower middle-class black neighborhoods. In Chicago, 72% of the movers in a housing choice mobility program moved to neighborhoods that were over 90% African American, despite the fact that over half of them surveyed, half of the movers, said that they would like to live in a neighborhood where there was a mix of African American, Hispanic, and white residents. We find similar kinds of outcomes with the MTO program and in attempts to place scattered site public housing. My research in North Kenwood, Oakland chronicles the 25-year and counting redevelopment of one public housing complex, the lakefront properties, that further illustrates the challenges of meeting fair housing goals in Hope 6-like developments. So this is the neighborhood that I studied. North Kenwood, Oakland is on the south side of the city. North Kenwood is the neighbor of South Kenwood, where Barack Obama's house is. So North Kenwood is really 4 blocks from Obama's house, which is, actually Obama lives right here, and so right here is North Kenwood, Oakland. And so North Kenwood, Oakland has been undergoing a couple of decades of gentrification, in particular gentrification by African Americans. I'll put some more statistics up about North Kenwood, Oakland later, but just trust me at this point that it's gentrifying, and I'll show you those statistics later. But so what I'll be talking about in this part is the redevelopment of the lakefront properties. And that's a photograph of the lakefront properties before they were demolished. So we know that one way to address racial discrimination in the provision of public and subsidized housing is through lawsuits. And the Gautreaux lawsuit in Chicago is one of the most famous. In 1967, Judge Richard Austin summarized the core allegation in Gautreaux as follows, quote, plaintiffs, all Negroes and either tenants in or applicants for public housing, allege that since 1950, the CHA has selected sites, deliberately or otherwise, for public housing projects almost exclusively within neighborhoods the racial composition of which was all or substantially all Negro at the time the sites were acquired for the purpose of, or with the result of, maintaining existing patterns of urban residential segregation by race in violation of the 14th Amendment. How many lawyers in here? A fair number? So you all understood that just fine, right? Woo, that's one long sentence. Nearly 30 years later, in 1996, Linda McGill, a black resident of North Kenwood, filed an affidavit with the Gautreaux Court, which continues to oversee public housing matters in Chicago. The letter shared her perspective on why she opposed plans to build new public housing, indeed replacement public housing for the lakefront properties in her neighborhood. And she wrote the following. Greater than 90% of new publicly funded CHA properties have been placed in minority neighborhoods. Until each and every other Chicago area community has an equal number, no additional publicly funded housing should be placed within the North Kenwood, Oakland community. We can't take any more. So obviously her point was echoing the initial reason for Gautreaux, and her statistics weren't any different from the statistics that had been entered in the Gautreaux lawsuit 30 years earlier. In this particular case, the question was about these were being demolished, and the question was, would they be replaced? Would the public housing be replaced, and would it be replaced in a neighborhood that was nearly 100% African American. In order to rebuild public housing in a black neighborhood, the Chicago Housing Authority had to go to the Gautreaux court. This time, they went with the Gautreaux lawyers on their side. That is, the Gautreaux lawyers argued for the building of public housing in an all-black neighborhood over the protests of the new black professional residents who were moving in. So whereas the Gautreaux lawyers had been fighting the CHA for many years, now they were coming in with the CHA requesting that new public housing units be built in this neighborhood. A significant turning point in the Gautreaux lawsuit came in 1981 when the judge issued a consent decree that even in his estimation stood, quote, in sharp contrast to the 1969 judgment ordered against the CHA. The original order took an unequivocal desegregationist stance, requiring the CHA and HUD to stop and undo the segregation it had created and severely limiting the amount of new public housing that could be built in black neighborhoods. The 1981 consent decree, however, retreated from this hard line. Under the revitalizing area, which was this 1981 consent decree, and this was one of the main provisions of the consent decree, public housing could be built in, quote, areas which have substantially minority population and are undergoing sufficient redevelopment to justify the assumption that these areas will become more integrated in a relatively short time. The 1981 concession all but erased the centrality of race and replaced it with this consideration of revitalization, and in particular with socioeconomic mix. By the time North Kenwood, Oakland became a battleground in the ongoing Gautreaux case, the court was guided by this new quasi-colorblind consent decree. As a result, it could only rule on the specific question before it regarding the definition and determination of revitalizing areas. I argue that the precedent set in the 1981 consent decree, which the court was now bound to follow, disallowed challenges based on historical racism. So anything that the residents wanted to bring about how the public housing got there in the first place and the disproportionate concentration of public housing in black neighborhoods was disallowed. An emphasis on the initial racial harm receded, and past wrongs were allowed to be recommitted. New black middle-class residents tried to make the case that black neighborhoods were disproportionately and unfairly the site of public housing placement. They marshaled numbers and statistics, but more compelling than the numbers and statistics were what they described with their eyes. One woman wrote the following in an affidavit to the Gautreaux court as it was considering this case. My home is located in the 3601 census tract, which is the northern boundary of the North Kenwood, Oakland Conservation Area. North of my house is a housing complex called Lake Grove Village. This complex was built with HUD funding in 1973 for low-income residents. There are over 400 units of housing located in a one-block radius. To the east of my home is the Lake Park Manor, a 12-story building which was built with HUD funding for low-income families in 1974. This building has 164 Section 8 renters. There are only 6 single-family homes and 1 six-flat unit in the 3600 block of Lake Park Avenue with this 162-unit building. Half of the west side of the block is vacant land. 1 block west of my home, from 36th and Ellis to 39th and Ellis, there are approximately 12 homes, 3 abandoned structures, and 396 CHA units, located at 38th and Ellis, called Madden Park Homes. Additionally, there are 12 units of CHA extensions at the northeast and northwest corners of 37th and Ellis. 2/3 of the land is vacant between 36th and Ellis and 37th and Ellis. In another affidavit, to counterbalance what seemed to be a collective amnesia on the part of the court and the Gautreaux lawyers, one resident wrote, quote, instead of these parties offering a remedy for past federal violations and discriminatory practices to the North Kenwood, Oakland community, the community must now prove its burden. Nonetheless, the only question before the court in these proceedings was the question of if this area was a revitalizing area, thus opening the door for replacement public housing units to be built there despite it being 100% African American. This revitalizing area question focused on the socioeconomic condition of the neighborhood and the income of its residents. Even Alexander Polikoff, himself one of the architects of this shift from race to class, assesses it with much ambivalence, writing, quote, in the important redevelopment context, our racial desegregation case had now been transmuted with the judge's blessing into a mixed-income economic integration vehicle. Whether or not this was cause for celebration is a good question. For fair housing advocacy, of which Gautreaux represents a foundational case, this story highlights the tension that has long existed. Should the provision of housing, especially affordable housing, be halted if and when it cannot be provided in a desegregated manner? This dilemma, I argue much more fully in the book and elsewhere, is a false one because it's born of the racist resistance to housing that black people might occupy outside of already black and mixed income neighborhoods. But as in the case of North Kenwood, Oakland, that history often gets erased in contemporary legal proceedings. This common and unfortunate antagonism between affordable housing and fair housing is, as I mentioned, a false one, and it's the result of insufficient teeth in policies and laws to open up recalcitrant municipalities and neighborhoods that currently do not share in the responsibility of providing housing for low-income families. Critique number 2. Many black neighborhoods are mixed income, but not by design, but instead by the combination of racial segregation and disproportionate black poverty, while whites live in more homogeneous middle-class environments. My first book, Black Picket Fences, studied one particular black middle-class neighborhood that lived this reality. Black middle-class neighborhoods have higher poverty rates, are much nearer to areas of concentrated poverty than our white middle-class neighborhoods, and thus the young people growing up in them have much different exposures than white middle-class young people. As demographer John Logan has put it quite succinctly, quote, "The average black or Hispanic household earning more than $75,000 lives in a poorer neighborhood than the average white resident earning less than $40,000. So here are some statistics here that give you a sense of what I mean. So these are the top 10. These are ordered by the disparity between the exposure to poverty among African Americans and the exposure to poverty among blacks. So the average black person in Newark, here you see the black exposure number. The average black person lives in a neighborhood with a poverty rate of about 18%. The average white person lives in a neighborhood with a poverty rate of about 5%. The average affluent black person lives in a neighborhood with a poverty rate of about 14%. And here you get what John Logan just said. The average affluent black person lives in a neighborhood with higher poverty than here the average white person, but if you were to look at just low-income whites, that number would still be lower than the poverty exposure of the average middle-class black person. So you see the top 10 cities where the disparity is the largest, and I just put Washington, D.C. down here for good measure. You still have the racial disparity. African Americans live in neighborhoods that have higher poverty rates than do whites, and affluent blacks in D.C. live in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates than do all whites in D.C. So you still see the racial disparity. It's just not as pronounced as the disparity in these cities up here. Yet while many black communities have been, and this is just one measure of mixed income, because of course mixed income is supposed to, many of the mixed income projects that we're building have 1/3 public housing, 1/3 affordable housing, and 1/3 market rate housing, and thus have much higher poverty rates than what most white neighborhoods experience. Yet while many black communities have been living the mixed income ideal for many years, such an arrangement has not ensured black neighborhoods' viability and vitality relative to white neighborhoods. Studies show that there is less retail investment in black and or central city neighborhoods, more poorly stocked pharmacies, fewer hospitals, higher concentrations of fast food restaurants, more visible drug sales, higher grocery prices, and lower levels of mortgage investment. And I could go on with my list if you all wanted to be here for much longer. Critique number 3. Mixed income scenarios promote a tyranny of the middle class. The rationale for mixed income communities is surely benign, but most of the research on such communities, most notably that by Mark Joseph at Case Western, has not found much of the social capital building effects that we hope will happen. So this is what we hope will happen in mixed income communities. There'll be social networks that link poor individuals to middle-class newcomers. Social control will be improved because middle-income residents will act as purveyors of order and strong management. And there'll be role modeling of upward mobility. But Mark Joseph's research and many others have showed there's not actually a lot of interaction across class that happens in these neighborhoods for a number of reasons. On the other hand, in studies of some mixed income communities, and definitely of more naturally occurring mixed income communities, and surely of gentrifying communities, we have myriad stories of negotiation, conflict, resistance, and displacement that illuminate the middle class biases that prevail when the incomes mix. Middle class desires for trendy boutiques and upscale restaurants win out over pawn shops and ethnic food stores. Their affinity for dog parks and garage parking curtails the usage of those spaces by children. And their fear of young black and Latino men prompts the police to sweep them from the street corners. The middle class is coveted not just for its money, but for its saving graces. So I'm going to give just one example from my research in North Kenwood, Oakland, again, a gentrifying neighborhood which is not a one Hope 6 project, but I guess a big Hope 6 project. It's not a Hope 6 project, but a big place where we're doing mixed income stuff. And this example gives some insight on how mixed income strategies may not exclude the poor per se, but are clear that their success relies on the exclusion of the poorly behaved. In 2000, so here's my North Kenwood, Oakland statistics to prove that it is gentrifying. You see the median family income has doubled. The percentage of families with incomes over $50,000 has tripled. The home ownership rate has doubled, and this is just the 2000 census. The median home values have shot way up, and the poverty rate has gone down precipitously. In 2004, when North Kenwood, Oakland was in full stride with the construction of housing across the neighborhood, a task force of residents was convened to begin planning for, quote, a safe and harmonious mixed-income community with affordable housing for all families and an aesthetic and functional physical environment, end quote. At one meeting of the task force, a resident made a suggestion for how to improve the physical environment. Her idea was to focus on one of the main thoroughfares, Drexel Boulevard, and she said this idea took off, and task force members imagined an inviting, active space. They would add decorative benches and garbage cans and flower pots and repave the cracked and buckled walkway. Here you can see the walkway from 1898, and they'd repair that. They would invite a competition of artists to put sculptures on Drexel Boulevard. In essence, they would return it to the grandeur it enjoyed in the late 19th century when Hyde Park was, quote, one of the preeminent addresses in Chicago. Into this discussion, a local police officer, a member of the task force who represented the emphasis on creating a safe community, offered the following, quote, when we're thinking about working on Drexel Boulevard, we should really think about discouraging some of the current uses there, because people are out there barbecuing and setting up tents, selling snow cones and drinking and just doing all kinds of things. People seem to think of it as a park, and they just come out and plant themselves. I would like to see a larger contingency of residents use the parkway. I've heard complaints from many people that they're afraid to go out and use it because of some of the people there. So we want to think about that as we plan. A number of suggestions flowed in support of this comment, such as making the benches uncomfortable, issuing citations for unlicensed vendors, and designating specific areas of the parkway for barbecuing. I was also a member of the task force, and so in response to this line of brainstorming, I raised the concerns that our ideas might contradict the second goal of our mission statement. We aim to create a harmonious community. These various deterrent strategies may alienate and anger people who use the parkway as it is, as this family was doing on a birthday celebration. They lived in one of the large courtyard, I'm pointing there, you all can't see that. They lived in one of these large courtyard buildings which don't have any yard space, and of course it's a fire hazard to barbecue on the back wooden porches, and so they were barbecuing on Drexel Boulevard. So I was told in response to my suggestion that perhaps it would upset the people who use it as it is, that the park was not harmonious because only a small minority of residents used it. And if the complaints received by the police department were the best indication, the ways in which that small minority used the parkway closed off its use by other residents. I asked, is barbecuing there illegal? And the police officer confirmed that it wasn't. She struggled to find the right word to describe what was happening. She tried loitering, but of course, sitting in the park was not loitering, and that's what it was meant to be for. So I didn't want to make my point too forcefully. I had participated, and we are participant observers, so then I turned to observing, and I observed the conversation drift toward turning Drexel Boulevard into a completely passive, decorative space with large flower arrangements and sculptures, and with no walkway and no benches. I also observed that none of the people whose use of Drexel Boulevard was being scorned in that task force meeting seemed to actually be members of the task force itself, meaning the folks who were barbecuing on Drexel Boulevard weren't at this meeting. Indeed, when you go to many community meetings in gentrifying neighborhoods, the gentrifiers are very, very active. Myself, I'm a gentrifier. The whole book is actually about this middleman and middlewoman position that many of the gentrifiers find themselves in. And this task force was no different, and it was dominated by homeowners and middle-class newcomers. Homeowners have yards and decks on which to socialize and barbecue. They don't need Drexel Boulevard for such purposes, and are fine with admiring the parkway from their car windows. This exercise in how to manage public space in a mixed-income neighborhood foregrounds the ways in which the face-off of homeowning, civil, middle-class, recent arrivals against people who play their music in public places, socialize in groups, barbecue in the park, can be rhetorically disdainful and substantively hostile. Working class and poor residents suffer as their behaviors are delimited by the desires of middle class homeowners. Critique number 4. This is an example from not research, but my current activism. So after writing Black on the Block and witnessing the politics that went into creating the demolition of the lakefront properties and the creation of Lake Park Crescent, I became aware of a housing project on the north side, the Lathrop Homes. The Lathrop Homes is a 925-unit development on the north side of Chicago. It's in a racially integrated, gentrifying neighborhood. It sits between Lakeview. For those of you all know Chicago, Lakeview is very predominantly white, now all the way gentrified, very high income. And on the other side is Logan Square, predominantly Latino, and gentrifying but much more slowly, and predominantly Latino but also racially mixed. It's between Clybourne and Diversity. It's along the riverfront, and it's very well located. It is, the landscaping at Lathrop Homes is quite phenomenal, and it has this riverfront view kind of meandering along the side of it. The CHA wants to demolish it to build a mixed-income development with the one-third, one-third, one-third model, and the residents want preservation with no market rate housing. The argument is that Lathrop's presence, the argument among the current residents, is that Lathrop's presence is the only way to preserve an income and racial mix. So to illustrate the questionable ends, so I have this as a cookie-cutter means. We have a mixed income kind of template that we follow, but for questionable ends, I raise the issue of what Lathrop Homes were planned to be back in the first year of the Plan for Transformation in Chicago. The Plan for Transformation is what basically what we talked about would happen to all the public housing in the city of Chicago. So Lathrop is a non-202 property. That means that there is no HUD requirement to demolish it. In the first Plan for Transformation, the CHA wrote, quote, "A total of 10 family properties are not currently subject to the Section 202 viability test. The capital program allocates $107 million to these properties. This funding is based on the cost to rehabilitate all units of this housing." So listed in those 10 non-Section 202 developments was the Lathrop Homes. And it goes on to say, quote, "Following redevelopment, the agency's goal is that the total number of public housing units be not less than the current number of occupied units." At the time, 747 of Lathrop's 925 public housing units were occupied. By the next year, the language had changed, and it continued to change every year in every Plan for Transformation up until today, when the plan is to deliver 400 public housing units, 400 affordable housing units, and 400 market rate units with these 1,200 revitalized units comprising a new community. So the plan now is, at least for some, if not all, demolition in a mixed income format. Over these years, residents have left and the buildings have gotten less safe. Currently, fewer than 200 of the units are occupied, and they're undergoing consolidation because of the need for, it's very expensive to heat all of the units, so they're undergoing consolidation. I would argue that in this case, there's still hope. It's hard to say there's still hope as the buildings begin to deteriorate, and once that deterioration takes full effect, demolition will seem to be the only possibility. But here we have a place where the resident population itself is already racially integrated. The neighborhood that surrounds it is racially integrated. There are substantial economic opportunities in the neighborhood, jobs, excellent public transportation, and nonetheless, there's this cookie-cutter model. And so in the end, it seems like these means are not to serve the ends of improving the lives, going back to our goals numbers 1, 2, and 3, our goal number 1, to improve the lives of low-income residents, but rather to improve the welfare of the Public Housing Authority and the city in making this an attractive place for new, higher-income residents. So this cookie-cutter approach is my fourth critique. So conclusions. Current policy. Choice neighborhoods, I would argue, run similar risks as the ones discussed here. Choice neighborhoods are not Hope 6 neighborhoods. They don't require a lot of demolition. It's not the same policy by any stretch. But their focus on mixed income neighborhoods, again, without safeguards against displacement, run some of this, and without explicit strategies for racial integration, run some of the same risks that I've talked about here. Promise neighborhoods, on the other hand, are a little different. Promise neighborhoods, again, from the website, quote, "The vision of the program is that all children and youth growing up in Promise neighborhoods have access to great schools and strong systems of family and community support that will prepare them to attain an excellent education and successfully transition to college and a career." So I would argue promising neighborhoods are a little bit more promising. They're what we would call, of course, an in-place strategy. There are the mobility strategies and there are the in-place strategies. The one thing I worry about Promise neighborhoods is, of course, it's under the Department of Education, and without really strong participation by HUD, the housing component, if these Promise neighborhoods become much more attractive, again, the kinds of safeguards against displacement and any lack of attention towards promoting fair housing goals might make Promise neighborhoods look like choice neighborhoods, which might look like Hope 6 neighborhoods. So I'll end with those nuggets there. I have to say that on these last nuggets, I look forward to learning from you all just as much as hopefully you've learned a little bit from me, because you all are the front lines doing the choice neighborhoods and the Promise neighborhoods. So I look forward to that discussion. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Holbert. I've been in this room on a number of occasions when we discussed Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Big table in the middle here, and we begin with the Gautreaux experiment, which took the people from public housing out to the neighborhoods. We provided the hired gun in terms of testing and validation and suing people who discriminated against them.
Mm-hmm.
That's one facet. The second facet is Ida B. Wells.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful project.
Mm-hmm.
Conventional public housing, now in that consolidating period, as you mentioned.
Gone. All gone. Ida B. Wells, gone.
That is consolidation.
Oh. I would use it. Okay.
Dust to dust, right?
I was going to give you an illustration of when you shake the cream on top of the milk. But let's get to the book.
Okay.
We shut down this department, shut down approval of 203B mortgage insurance in Chicago. Rapid racial change, the way you end it is to keep people from buying, and we control it, so we stop it. That was the third point. Employment has to fit into your discussion. Once upon a time, there were jobs in Chicago for people coming up on Illinois Central, working in the packing house and steel industry and so forth. All that's gone. So now you have jails that are full of young black men who can't make bond because nobody loves them anymore. And so they sit there until the case comes up. They get 6 months, 3 months, or something, usually if they've served. Once upon a time in this room, we brought the government to see what could be done about employment, particularly construction employment. We had an in-depth examination, we reviewed it, and we had a hearing at Customs House, since the construction workers wouldn't let us hold our meeting in a hotel. We had United States Marshals to help us get from A to B and so forth. All that has happened before community reinvestment comes along, where you're looking at lending money, and then another wave, New Shore, insurance redlining. We've investigated that. We found that insurance redlining is a reality in Chicago. And then finally, you get to the question of violence. If you move into the block that's white, you may get bombed. You expect that. That's normal in Chicago. It's still normal. If you're Jewish and you move into a neighborhood, you will have your property splashed and painted and so forth. Constitution provides for fair housing. Illinois law never enforced and so forth. So we've had a long experience. The cases are all Chicago cases. It's our national laboratory. You see, Phillips, the car wash case, that's Chicago. The 4F cases, all the lending cases, that's Chicago. So when you come as a new generation looking at these issues, you say, well, this department is basically a fair housing department, not just limited to this gentleman's responsibility, but all of the department provides money for housing, for the parks, the flowers, everything is fair housing HUD. So congratulations on your statement, and we're glad to see a new generation come to examine it.
The videographer asked me to repeat the question before I should have turned over the microphone, so I am sorry, but I just want to highlight and thank you for that history. I do hope that things have gotten somewhat better, that, well, there are fewer house bombings when black folk move in, if, very few, if any. That's not to say that there's not racial discrimination in housing. It just happens a little differently than it used to. But I do appreciate that history, very helpful history. And I definitely, in my own work, try to be respectful of that history and know that history, and especially in the city of Chicago. So thank you. Yes. Hey! You snuck in back there.
Thank you. This is great. And as you know, I'm a big fan of Chicago, but now in this national purge, it's really clear while Chicago is enigmatic of these issues, that these issues play out differently across the country. And I know that you're an ethnographer, so your work has been born out of this experience. But if you could reflect a little bit about maybe other conversations, other literature that might suggest that this plays out differently, maybe on the West Coast or in other places, or is your sense that this is the way our mixed income approaches play out similarly?
Thank you very much. You're very right that place really matters. And, Chicago is, as I think is borne out even when I compare Chicago and Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. is not, we don't think of it as the land of milk and honey for racial integration and racial progress, but it looks even much better than Chicago. So I think that's very important to point out. I will say overall, from my reading of the literature, shows that I think we're pretty clear that in mixed income communities, there's not the cross-class social interaction that we hoped would happen does not seem to be happening most places. That's very difficult to foster for many reasons, not just the fact that folks are of different class strata, but that goes along with so many other things, that they're different in terms of family status, married or not married, children or no children. They obviously have different occupations or not working. They also, of course, have the racial differences. So they have different time schedules, different uses of public space, so many things where that is the reason why there isn't a lot of that cross-class integration or interaction. But I think we can be pretty sure that that's not the mechanism through which mixed income communities are going to work if they're going to work. The mechanism about the leveraging mechanism, basically that new upper income folks will bring needed resources to poor communities. Even in my own research, that leveraging does work. The critical approach that I'm taking here, though, is how can we be sure to put safeguards that mixed income communities don't tip to be upper income communities? Now, of course, Hope 6 projects, insofar as they are somewhat delimited geographically, they don't run that risk because it's built in that they will be mixed income. But if they, and Sean Zeilenbach, is that how you say it? Zeilenbach, right. Some of his research shows the fact that the neighborhoods around Hope 6 neighborhoods are experiencing this upward socioeconomic trending, which is, of course, what we want. The question is, are we there at the tipping point? Are we putting in safeguards so that the neighborhood, that we don't have displacement, and that we don't have now a beautiful, wonderful neighborhood that had been a very high poverty neighborhood, and now none of the people who lived there in the beginning are benefiting from those investments. So I totally agree that that many of these things are working and working differently across the country, and the emphasis I want to put on are these safeguards.
So speaking of those safeguards, aside from, housing, you think, okay, well, safeguard naturally is, preserving affordable housing, one-for-one replacement, that sort of thing. Aside from the housing safeguards, what other safeguards can you put in place so that that new community doesn't, or the old community rather, doesn't feel alienated?
Right. So first on the housing ones, yes, I want to amplify the housing safeguards. Preserving affordable housing. One of the challenges I know that a lot of planners face when they're doing affordable housing is many of the programs, the first family who moves in gets the benefit of the affordable housing subsidy, and then they can sell it at market rate. The affordable housing subsidy doesn't stick with the house. And so I know there are programs to try to make sure that doesn't happen, and I think those need to be expanded. When we're thinking about affordable housing, we need to think about it sustainable in perpetuity. Okay, so I won't elaborate on other things like community land trusts and all those other kinds of safeguards. But non-housing safeguards. One of the things that I emphasize in the book is when we do Hope 6 programs and we move public housing residents into Hope 6 developments, they often get some kind of good neighbor training. But the middle class folks who move in don't get any good neighbor training. We just assume they know how to be good neighbors. But they don't. And they don't know how to live in mixed income communities. Indeed, that's why I'm talking about this tyranny of the middle class, because their assumption is the way I do it is right, and if the way they did it was right, they wouldn't be poor. It's a very blaming the victim kind of approach, right? But there's nothing wrong with sitting on the porch. I have so many examples in the book about talking on your cell phone sitting on the porch, or kids. I mean, kids are a huge area of discordance in mixed income communities, oftentimes because the market rate folks don't have them at all, and those of us who don't have kids don't want to see them all that much. We chose not to have them for a reason, right? But kids aren't wrong, and so, for example, there have been places where there not sufficient play space has been created for kids, and then what do kids end up doing? They end up playing in the hallway because there's no place else to play. So I think other kinds of, first of all, I think many of the mixed income projects try to sell them to the market rate folks very hush-hush. It's not like, look at this new mixed income neighborhood you're moving into. They don't quite have a sense, because of course we changed the name, we erased Ida B. Wells' Oakwood Shores, we make everything we can to sell the units, and so they don't know what they're moving into, and you see that they're a little surprised. Again, Mark Joseph's research tells us that, a little surprised once they move in. So I think upfront discussion, dialogue, talking about, I often give this example. I was once on a radio show, and somebody called in about, kids being loud or whatever, and I reminisced on my own childhood and all of our childhoods. I'm sure y'all cursed probably loudly on your block or whatever you were doing, dancing a little too. This wasn't my neighborhood, doing your little dance, whatever it was, break dancing. We were talking about the 80s, and those are the kinds of things, though, that can set some people's antenna off. And those are the kinds of things we need to talk about.
Actually, I'm from Chicago, and so historically, most of the folks that lived in those communities, Ivy Wells and others, Stable Gardens, all of those areas, those were areas where poor people lived. And most of the folks of influence lived in the suburbs. So, of course, in the 80s, the social scientists came up with this grandiose plan to say that we're going to have mixed income developments. And as you stated, that we're going to have this upliftment of poor people by bringing in this mixed income community. It's interesting that your data is saying that even though we put these things in place, that focus, there's problems. Well, I would think it was going to be a problem anyway. There's no way in the world you're going to tell me that all these people who've been living their lives a certain way was going to change. And that's obvious in Chicago, because now, when they move those folks out of those projects, they all move to the suburbs. Okay, so now we're showing that in the suburbs you have this increase in crime and all the things that plague the inner city has now been moved. And now you have this transference of folks like in, I'm trying to think of the community, Bronzeville, in the Bronzeville area. I mean, I know people that lived in there. These were all like 3-story homes and 2 flats and 3 flats that are now single-family homes. So when you talk about the gentrification, you're talking about gentrification in the worst way, because now these people are now homeowners. These are not flats anymore. These people are, and so when you have ownership of a house or property, you have a whole different mindset in terms of how you want your neighborhood to look and how you want to expend it, and nothing's changed. But Chicago has always been very segregated, and so now you have this whole position where, I mean, I drove down this. I went home recently, and I'm driving down areas where I'm looking at white folks walking down the street that I knew, 20 years ago that would have never happened. They would have never not walking down the street. Now they might have drove down the street. They wasn't walking. So there's major changes that's happening in Chicago, but I think in the recent census tract, you actually saw what whole neighborhoods change.
So there's so much there, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to repeat it all for the question, for the video. The one interesting thing is that you began by saying that poor people used to live near in Ida B. Wells and Madden Park and so on.
All those was very good neighborhoods.
Right.
If you think about this in terms of the lake, you talked about it was 4 high-rises right on the lake.
Right, those are the ones that right, yeah.
So I know what you're talking about. So we always said, well, wow, they got a great, this is a great opportunity for folks to live in this particular area. Of course, in that area, all the things, the gangs and everything else, drug dealing and everything that exists, it exists. In my world, it exists, but I lived it. That was my space.
Yeah, so the one thing I wanted, it was interesting that you talked about basically class segregation with middle and upper income blacks living in the suburbs and poor black folk living near Ida B. Wells, because that's a much more recent phenomenon. And indeed, many people think nostalgically about the 50s and 60s when the trope always is that the doctor lived next door to the person who was on public assistance, for example. So people look nostalgically at that moment, and black suburbanization is it's really right now, I'm sure you all know in the media, from the 2000 to the 2010 census that we paid a special attention to black suburbanization, and so we're seeing that much more in the recent period. The issue of where the people displaced from the demolition of public housing in Chicago have been moving, most of the research shows that they have not, by and large, been moving to the south suburbs, and that part of the impression of that movement is that
those folks that lived there.
That's what I was going to say.
You had folks that still moved in that compact.
Yeah, part of the impression is that people generalize. One poor person stands in for 12 public housing residents. Every poor person must have been displaced from public housing. And so you have neighborhood change. But when you look at the actual movement trajectories of people displaced from public housing, they by and large move to lower middle class black neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city. Some have moved to the suburbs, definitely, but I would argue that the rhetoric around that is much larger than the empirical reality for that movement. I think those are two things I wanted to say. I had a number of other. Maybe it'll come back when I get to, if there's another question, it'll remind me of something else.
I have a quick question, because I'm sitting here thinking that is it possible for us to expect for displacement not to occur, considering just the sheer numbers? So is the approach not to eliminate displacement or to minimize displacement? Because it's going to happen, and unless my thinking is that yes, displacement will occur, but if you're trying to realize this true mixed income community, then the only real way that you're going to do it is to get consistent collaborations among all the different government agencies, not just housing and HHS, but you have to do from Justice Department, from transportation, from education, so that all aspects of what cause people to move or to stay, will be somehow addressed.
Right. So the question is it possible to eliminate displacement or only minimize it, or is the goal perhaps just to minimize displacement? So I totally agree that we need to triangulate efforts, or however many sides you had to your model. And I would argue that minimizing displacement is at least a good first start and goal, and get us all on that same page. Some of the interesting things is that some of the developments in many of the cities across the country, Hope 6 developments or other kinds of choice neighborhood developments, are going into places that were depopulated to begin with. And so you can begin some of this reinvestment without much displacement at all, because there is a fair amount of vacant land, there are a fair number of vacant units, and so you can do a lot of investments without doing much displacement. So the moral of the story, or the lesson that I learned from North Kenwood, Oakland, is this neighborhood began when this neighborhood began a transformation, 1/3 of the land was vacant. So nobody imagined that they'd get to a point where we'd be talking about displacement, because there was so much vacant land. So I think we have to make sure that we imagine and expect that moment is going to come, and so beginning to think about it early on rather than now. What often happens is, oh, now the land is too expensive to build affordable housing, and that then becomes a challenge, a barrier to trying to minimize displacement and creating the safeguards later in the game, when we began, we just couldn't even imagine that we'd have to put safeguards in place.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was thinking about another context for mixed income development is as a result of inclusionary zoning ordinances, which is a tool that many local communities use to actually increase the number of hard affordable housing units. And I was wondering whether you're seeing some of the same patterns play out for those projects that are built in inclusionary zoning.
It's a very interesting point. The question is about inclusionary zoning as one model of mixed income communities, and one model as a kind of fair shared disbursement of affordable housing units. And this, I think, echoes the point I was making in my critique number, 2, I think, about how racial segregation works. Here's the example from the local case again. In the North Kenwood, Oakland neighborhood, when the neighborhood was transforming, the alderman, who's now the Cook County Board of President of the Cook County Board, Tony Preckwinkle, was very committed to affordable housing, and began in the new developments to try to think about those safeguards down the line, and had an inclusionary zoning, some inclusionary zoning requirements for new development in her ward. What she would say every time she would remind people of why she was doing this was, because other aldermen in the city in white neighborhoods that should be building affordable housing don't require this, I have to require it. And so she was very aware that, again, this was a question of fair share. And while she was willing to make this case, and while we saw black neighborhoods were welcoming of public housing in the 50s, it was white neighborhoods that was very resistant to public housing. So I think what often happens is, not always, because we have great examples of a place like Montgomery County, but many of the places that have inclusionary zoning mechanisms are places that are already taking on their fair share and committed to those goals, and it's the places that resist such measures that are the places where we should be putting affordable housing to create both class integration and racial integration.
Time for one more question. You've been very generous with your time. I want to thank you. You definitely are not ivory tower academic. We're not concrete tower bureaucrats. We're both in the community. In fact, today Secretary Donovan at the Zower was speaking at the Navy Pier with the governor on affordable housing. So I want to thank you for bringing your ideas and perspectives and a real depth of understanding of Chicago. I noticed that you were you have the Harold Washington chair, and I cannot imagine having a greater honor than to have that chair take his values of what he started back in '83 in Chicago and carry that on today. So I think as we do our work, definitely informed by what your perspectives, and we have a lot of shared values and a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you for spending the time today.